Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti. I am MrPhotographer.com. Sharpening and noise reduction. To the new photographer, it can be very confusing, and even to the more experienced photographer, they'll often get mixed results. I think that's because they don't have a firm understanding about what each of the sliders actually do. In this video, I'm going to clear that all up. About once a month or so, I'll get an email from someone with an attachment. They took a very important image and unfortunately they didn't nail focus. And they'll send me the image and they'll ask me, is there anything I could do to sharpen it, or is there anything I could tell them to do to sharpen it? Unfortunately, when we're talking about sharpening, that's not what can be done. You can't take an image that is out of focus and suddenly make it focused. Just can't be done. What we're doing when we're sharpening an image is we're doing a little trick with contrast. We're making the exact edge where a lighter thing is touching a darker thing, and we're adding contrast to that tiny little edge. And when we do that, it makes the image appear sharper than it actually was resolved at. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to go to these gray bars. And I'm going to zoom in on a transition zone. This is a dark side and a light side, and that edge is dark, and this edge over here is light. So that little edge is what we're actually doing, or what we're affecting when we're adding sharpening to an image. Now I'm going to go to the Detail tab, and we'll go to the Sharpening slider. And you'll notice when I moved that to the right, at that exact tiny little edge, we're making the dark side a little darker and the light side a little lighter. And by definition, that's contrast. So we're adding contrast to that very tiny little edge. And that's what we're doing when we're sharpening an image. Now, there's other sliders under there. Radius, you could see now on this dark side, we have this tiny little dark edge we darkened with the sharpening slider itself, right? And then on the light side, we have that tiny little light edge that we lightened. The radius is how far out, how thick do you want those to be? If I take that radius slider, move it to the right, you see we're making them much thicker. So the left side is thicker and the right side is thicker right at that edge. Now, in real life, what the radius slider would be used for is if you're sharpening something with very fine detail, a macro of an insect, and it's got tiny little hairs coming off its head, you would take that radius slider, move it to the left. You want a smaller edge of contrast. On the other hand, if you're doing a landscape and you're sharpening a landscape, there's nothing really super fine there, and you may want to move radius to the right. So really, you could just eyeball your image and move that about and see where it gives you the best effect. Now, the Detail slider really just kind of supercharges the Amount slider. Let's take radius to the right, so we make them thick. So we have this dark edge and that light edge. And if I take Detail to the right, it's just going to make the darker darker and the lighter lighter. So it's really kind of supercharging the Amount slider. And those other lines there, those are JPEG artifacts, so you could just ignore those. But you could see what it does. And masking, I'm going to cover in a real-life scenario and tell you what that does. But that gives you an idea what these three sliders do. But really, that's not the only sharpening that is in Lightroom. There's more. Actually, if you go up to the Basic tab, we have contrast. I mentioned that when you're making that edge lighter and the other edge darker, you're adding contrast. And really, the contrast slider is pretty much the same thing. Let's go to 1:1 maybe. Okay. And if we go to contrast, you're just going to make the lighter parts lighter and the darker parts darker. And that's contrast. So that, in effect, makes the image look a little sharper. Also, texture and clarity. Look at clarity if I move that to the right. It's got a different effect than contrast. It makes this edge lighter and this edge darker, and it kind of just almost like you added a graduated filter there. It's just kind of gradually getting darker that way. So lighter, darker. You see what I mean? So that's what that clarity does, but it is adding contrast to the edge. So there's with clarity at 0, and there's clarity up. So it's adding contrast at that edge. Now texture does it as well, but it does it in a smaller zone. Hopefully you can see that. Let's go to maybe 2 to 1. And let's take texture down and move it to the right. You can see that it's still making this side darker. That side maybe a little lighter, but it kind of fades out a little bit. Not as much as clarity. Clarity affected all the way, almost maybe 2/3 of the way across the color bar. And texture's just doing it a little bit more than the detail amount slider, but less than the clarity slider. Now, those of you that are familiar with, let's say, an application like On1 Photo Raw or Luminar, know that they have a structure filter in each of those applications, and it's small, medium, and large. And I think you could draw a corollary that the detail slider of sharpening amount slider is small structure. Then up in the basic tab, the texture slider is medium structure, and the clarity slider is large structure. So you would affect these, or you would use these to affect very specific parts of the image. So let's get away from these color bars and get to a real image and talk about noise reduction. Really, I strongly recommend that you do noise reduction early in your workflow. As a matter of fact, I recommend you do tone adjustments first. You could do white balance too if the white balance is off. So do white balance and tone adjustments. And when I talk about tone adjustments, I'm actually just talking about 4 sliders: highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Do those. Don't do contrast, because contrast kind of makes it look sharper, right? So we don't want to do that. The reason why you don't want to sharpen the image at this point is because you didn't remove the noise. And when you sharpen it, you're actually sharpening the noise, and you're going to make the noise that much harder to remove. So right now, don't do anything that's going to enhance the sharpness of the image. So just do the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. Don't even do any color adjustments, nothing there. Don't do any tone curve. If you're shooting with a DSLR that requires lens corrections, you could do those. But then go to the detail tab, and you'll notice it's broke up into 2 sections, sharpening and noise reduction. And the noise reduction section has 2 subsections, luminance and color. And I recommend you zoom in. In this case, I'm zoomed in 2 to 1. And if we zoom in, you can see there's a lot of noise. And there's a lot of these color specks. Most often they'll be red, green, or blue. That's color noise, and it's super common. And it's actually very easy to rid. Go to the color slider, move that to the right, and you can see, just go to a certain point and it's gone. It's just like you just kind of move it, bam. It just disappears at a certain point. Now we have a lot of grain noise there. That's the luminance noise, and we'll get rid of that in a moment. But that's what color noise is. And look at that. Now there's 2 sliders below it. There's a detail slider, which really won't do much with the color noise. And I'm going to explain that better up here in the noise reduction, luminance noise section. But the smoothness slider, if I move this to the left, let me show you. See these kind of color blotches came in there? Sometimes you'll find that you'll get rid of the actual kind of color dots that are there, but you got these color blotches. And then what you would do is move this smoothness slider to the right, and it will just get rid of those as well. So we got rid of all the color noise. It's the easiest noise to get rid of. Now, as far as luminance noise reduction, when we take that slider to the right, we're just kind of smoothing out that noise. And you could see that it got rid of it, but it really smooths away detail as well. Look at the face of our gorilla. If I take luminance all the way down to 0, you can see there's a lot of little detail in her skin. And if I move that to the right like that, we just kind of obliterated all that detail. That's where this detail slider comes in. And again, there's the same sliders in the color noise reduction section as well. You go to that detail slider and you move that to the right, you'll rescue some of that detail. See how it's drawn that detail back? But hopefully won't reintroduce the noise. See it? Does a really good job. So that's your first kind of step of sharpening is right here. So you're kind of rescuing some of that detail. Now what contrast does, quite often when you reduce noise, you smooth out all that noise, you're reducing contrast as well. And if you move that to the right, you're going to add contrast. And it's very light. It's not as heavy as the contrast slider in the basic tab. Like look right in here. You can see this light area and this dark area. If I take this contrast slider and move it to the right, you can see how it's bringing back contrast. It's reintroducing the noise though. So we're just going to leave that down. Now the way I go about doing this is I'll do color first, get rid of that. Then I'll go to the luminance slider and I move it in groups of 10. I usually start off somewhere in the middle, like 50. So I'll put it at 50, we still have noise. And then I'll go up to 60. So I move it in groups of 10. We still have noise. Then I'll go up to 70. And there's still a tiny bit of noise. That probably would be good enough for me, but for the sake of this demonstration, let's go to 80. Right? Okay, the 80, the noise is gone. Now I went from 70, there was a little noise there. 80, the noise is gone. But I'll go then to 75, so I'll split the difference. So I just want to narrow it down. I really don't want to smooth it out so much that I'm going to sacrifice detail. Even though I could draw some of that detail back with the detail slider, I just don't want to do that. So we'll just leave it at 80. This is a super noisy image. And by the way, in the description below this video, I'll have a list of the equipment I used and all the camera settings I used to capture all the images I'm showing you. So we'll move detail to the right to kind of rescue some of that detail. And I think that's good. So that's the way I would go about doing it. I would do tone adjustments first. I would do white balance if it needed it, lens corrections, then I'll do noise reduction. So the noise is done. Now comes the sharpening part. Now I mentioned at the top that we really have three different types of sharpening. We have that large detail, medium detail, and small detail. And I strongly recommend you start with large and work your way down to small. So go to the basic tab now, and you could zoom in for this if you'd like, or just whatever works best for the specific image you're working at, and start with clarity. That's large detail. You can move that to the right. Now actually, larger detail would be contrast. So we can move that to the right and add some contrast if we want. Also, dehaze adds contrast to the image. Now there's no haze here. So those are the largest details. So you would do those first, contrast and dehaze at this point. Then you would go to clarity. So we're starting to drill down on our sharpening as well. So we'll move clarity to the right a little bit. Now texture's the medium structure. And that's going to affect mainly, I think, the face of the gorilla and some of the fur of the gorilla. And we'll move that to the right. Then we'll jump down and do sharpening here. Now for this sharpening on the detail panel, I like to zoom in. You also could just, if it's not open already, roll down this triangle and you have a little like one-to-one preview of the image here. You also could activate this tool, and then anywhere you hover over the image, that's what will show up in this window. Now I typically don't like using this window. I just think it's too small. I much prefer to zoom in. So I'll zoom in on somewhere like, where there's detail here of the gorilla's face. And I'll move that to the right. Now you remember, it's just making the edges more contrasty. You can see how it's reintroducing the noise. We're getting some noise reintroduced there. So it's kind of a trade-off. Always is. Now radius, move it to the right. We're going to be affecting a larger radius. So that's going to bring that edge out. Remember from our gray bars, move it to the left. It's going to narrow it down. And I think the default position was fine. We could, again, the detail slider works exactly the same that I mentioned in the gray bars. It just kind of supercharges the amount slider. And I don't think there's no need to move that. And masking, I'm going to cover in the next image we're going to do. So I think that looks pretty good right there. I want to pull that down a little bit. Now, if that noise was really bothering me that I reintroduced slightly, I could come in and add more noise reduction here if I want, but I think it's fine. So I think that looks pretty good. Now I could continue on with any processing I want to do, but that typically is the last thing I'll do is sharpening. Now let's do another image, kind of beginning to end, a landscape image here. I did do the tone adjustments. The white balance is fine. I didn't do anything else. I did lens, oh no, this was a mirrorless camera, so there wasn't any lens corrections required. So what we're going to do is we'll go to detail first, and it added some default amount of sharpening. So let's just bring that down. But what I will do is zoom in. So I want to remove noise now, and I'm looking, usually the sky will have a lot of noise. And again, I will take that luminance noise reduction, I'll move it to like 40. You know, a number like that. It removed it all. So I'll move it to 30. And it still looks like it's gone. And by the way, I don't see any color noise at all, but I'll move that to 10 just in case, because I'm looking at a very small part of the image. All right, so we'll move it to 20. All right, there's a little noise there, so I'll go to 25. There's still a little noise there, like 28, and it looks pretty much it's gone. So I'm done with noise reduction. Then I'll continue on. I'll go to the basic tab. I'll add some contrast. I prefer to add contrast usually with the tone curve. Just add some medium contrast. Then now I'll go to that large detail. Well, let's add some saturation, just a little bit. But now I'll go to the large detail, which is the clarity slider. Go there, move that to the right, just kind of eyeball it. Now go to that medium detail, which is the texture slider. Move that to the right. See, that really made it kind of pop, that slider right there. Then I'll go to the actual detail tab, to the sharpening slider, and I'll zoom in. And this is going to do the fine detail. So I would expect like these little like darker kind of lines on this post here. I think it's going to affect those. It's going to affect a lot. It's going to affect the dock as well and stuff. But we'll move that to the right. You can see how it's really making that kind of, see those edges much sharper. That's over sharpened though. So we'll bring that down. What you'll often find too is your eyes will get fatigued when you're looking at the image so long. And you'll tend to over sharpen it because it doesn't, your eyes are tired and your brain is tired of looking at it. So it's good to walk away for a while and let your eyes rest for a half hour. So then come back and readjust any of the sharpening, because you'll often find you over sharpened it. And I might be over sharpening it now. But we'll bring it like to 40. And you can move radius around. There's really, this is a landscape image. I think the radius at the default position is fine. Detail at the default position. But what I want to really talk about is masking. We don't need to sharpen everything with these controls. We really just want to sharpen the dock and the buildings. Don't need to sharpen the sky. As a matter of fact, when I turn sharpening up, I reintroduce some noise up in there. So we really don't want to sharpen, let's say, these expansive parts of the blue sky, even the water there, parts of that. So what you could do is move masking to the right, and it will apply the sharpening only to the parts of the image that have transition changes, like the buildings, the dock, and so on. And what you could do is hold the Alt or Option key when you move this slider, and that will help you see what you're doing. It's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. Hold that in, click on the slider. The entire screen is white. That means, white means sharpening is being applied everywhere. Move it to the right, and now where black is coming in, that's where sharpening is not being applied. So I don't want it applied to the sky. You can see how it's not applying it to parts of those posts, parts of the dock, and so on. So wherever white is where the sharpening is being applied. So I just really want to sharpen those edges, like right like that. I think that looks pretty good right there. And if I zoom in, I don't see any noise in the sky now. And I think that is properly sharpened. I think it looks fine. Now there's some other things you could do that may help you sharpen your image. If you hold the Alt or Option key, Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac, and click on the amount slider, you'll get a black and white image. Many photographers feel this helps them sharpen the image when they pull that color out. So this helps them better sharpen their image. Similarly, hold that Alt or Option key in and click on that radius tab, and you get this kind of weird, kind of embossed gray look. And if you move that to the right, you can see you're going to see the radius edges stronger. So those edges, remember we were with the gray bars, how we made those thicker. So that's what we're actually doing there, and that helps you maybe better see those edges. Similarly for detail, it will do the same thing, I think. If you hold that Alt or Option key in and click down, same thing. You get that kind of embossed look. for lack of a better way to describe it. And that may help you better apply amount, radius, and detail to your image. Most photographers I know don't really bother with that, but they always hold the Alt or Option key in for masking. It just really does help a lot. Now, similarly, for luminance, detail, and contrast, you'll get a black and white image. So if you click down for noise reduction, I'm talking about, you'll get the black and white image there, black and white image there, and black and white image there. And it won't do anything for these three sliders. It just doesn't do it because you're trying to get rid of color. So it's not going to give you color noise. So it's not going to give you a black and white image. So it doesn't do anything. So experiment with that Alt Option key on these sliders and see if they help you. I've found in the past that sometimes holding the Alt or Option key and adjusting radius does help. But most often, especially for an image like this, that doesn't have a really strong subject in it, it's not even doing anything. It doesn't help at all. So that is the way I go about doing it. So this image would be pretty much done. I'd probably add a vignette to it. Like that. A little darker vignette, something like that. So that image is done. So that is, I think, everything you need to know about sharpening and noise reduction. And remember that really all sharpening is you're adding contrast to very specific parts of the image. With the contrast slider, you add contrast. With the dehaze slider, you're also adding contrast, and those are kind of gross amounts of contrast. With the clarity slider, you're refining it a little more. You're adding contrast, but it's mainly more towards the mid-tones of the image. With the texture slider, again, you're adding contrast, but it's more towards the middle sized objects in the image. And then, of course, with the detail amount slider, you're adding contrast to the smallest parts of the image. So that's what that is. So hopefully that all made sense. Thank you, everyone who watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.